Look at portraits. I think I'm making good time. There's a lot to say. Portraits are my thing. It's what I focus on. And this is the image that I added to the image list. There's like hundreds and hundreds of portraits of men and women and nuns and whatnot. But I felt this was the important one to include as an exemplar of portraiture. You know, we can talk about different types of portraits. This is by Miguel Cabrera, that mid-18th century painter. Painted around 1750. It can be considered like a historical portrait because by 1750 she's been dead like almost 70 years. You know, Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz lived in the late 17th century. And as some of you may know already if you read the blurb on the AP Art History site, Sor Juana was a prodigy. She was absolutely brilliant and she didn't want to marry. She joins another convent and then eventually winds up with the Hieronymites, and she devotes her life to study. She's a scholar. She's believed to have had one of the largest libraries in New Spain, if not the Americas. She wrote poetry, she wrote all sorts of things, and she was a celebrity during her life. She was befriended by the viceroy, especially the viceroy's wife, the vicereine. She would visit her all the time, and there's some suggestion. I mean, Sor Juana wrote poetry for the viceroy that's very erotic, so there appears to have been a suggestion that there was some kind of romantic thing happening between Sor Juana and the viceroy's wife.
Netflix has a series.
Yeah, Sor Juana. There's a series, an 8-episode series.
She wrote poems about his wife.
Yeah, about the viceroy, who they were friends. She was her patroness.
She asked her to write poems for her,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. And she would visit her all the time, and she was friends with all the celebrities. She was friends with the artists and church officials, and she was well known, very impressive. And this portrait allows us to talk about gender in the colonial context, and especially the context of convents. Convents are fascinating things to talk about, because they're not like what we think of convents today. Back in the colonial period, there are different types of convents that reflect the social hierarchy. There was an imperial convent for noble women from Spain. There were elite aristocratic convents, quite a few, for aristocratic, Creoles, Creole women. Then you have convents for poor women. And then some convents almost function like hospitals or mental asylums, for homeless women and whatnot. So the convent structure seems to kind of reflect the social hierarchy, but the very wealthy aristocratic convents, they were very prestigious. And elite families wanted to have their daughters in the convents. It added to their prestige and their cultural capital. A daughter's stay in the convent could be temporary until she was ready to marry to keep her out of trouble. They'd stick her in a convent. Or she could devote her life to convent life. Okay, which varied. The convent cultures vary. Some are really take vows of poverty, and they spend their lives just praying and meditating, doing charitable acts. Other convents were like palaces, where they had slaves and servants, and they're quite amazing places. And the interesting thing about convents is that convents provide spaces for women who don't want to pursue the typical expectations of women. You don't have to get married. You can study and be literate, okay? So the convent, actually religious individuals like nuns and friars were not considered male or female. They were considered a third gender because they were freed. They were freed. Friars and nuns were not, they were considered like a third gender because they were freed from the expectations of men and women out in outer society, which meant that in the convent, women could be scholars. Another thing to think about is, especially with the very wealthy aristocratic convents, in order to get your daughter in, it's like a sorority. You have to pay a dowry. Okay? And the rituals, like she's getting married to Christ, there's a whole elaborate ritual around that. I'm going to talk about that shortly. But families had to pay a large dowry. So if you can think of a convent that had 50 young women, it's a lot of money. So in the convent, in the colonial period, convents functioned like banks. It's the convents that gave out loans and credit with interest. The nuns bought properties and rented them out. The nuns in the convents were patronesses of the art. They were art patrons. So women had power in the convent. They were freed. They didn't have to get married and be subservient. They were in the convent where they could be scholars, they could be managers, financiers, patrons. So the convent's a very interesting institution in the colonial period. So understanding that about convents, there's a lot of material on convents if you're interested in that. Then we can place this portrait in its place, and you can understand then. She didn't want to get married. She wanted to study. She, goes into the convent, devotes her life to study, to reading, to writing, to producing. What got her in trouble is that she wrote a letter that was critical of a church official. And he eventually realized what happened, and she got censored. So what they did is they removed her library, and she was not allowed to read or write anymore. And shortly thereafter, she was miserable, of course, but that was her punishment. And she wound up, during an epidemic, getting sick and died. She died at, I think, at 42 years of age. But she was a genius. She's a prodigy. There's a famous scene. There have been plays of her life, and now that series.
Recommend the series, or is it off historically? Is it?
No, you should see it. Yeah, it's yeah. It's only 8 episodes, you know, but it's
all in Spanish.
Sor Juana. Yeah. So there's a whole body of scholarship around Sor Juana. There's a whole body of scholarship because of how we understand who she is. I mean, feminists, she's become like an icon for Latinas and Chicanas. She's like of the feminist movement. For the LGBTQ movement, you know, she's become sort of an icon. So, I mean, she's really, like many of these historical figures, they become symbols, you know, and she's one of these very important figures historically. So during this period, okay, so she lived in the late 17th century. She's been dead for a while. This is the mid to late 18th century, where we find that the Spanish Bourbons are criticizing American-born Creoles. They're criticizing American-born Hispanics and accusing them of being intellectually lethargic, of being dissolute and undisciplined. You know, it's like this propaganda, you know, against the American-born Hispanics. And American-born Hispanics and Creoles start to respond and defend themselves, saying, no, we have an intellectual tradition. You know, we are disciplined. And there's this one Creole, Jose Aguilar Yaguren, who publishes a book called Biblioteca Mexicana, Mexican Library, where he traces the philosophers, the major thinkers in Mexico, starting with the Aztec philosophers, all the way through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, sort of as a demonstration of the intellectual tradition that's local. You have artists like Miguel Cabrera. If you look at this is painted right when this is happening. It's a local celebrity. It's a Creole intellectual, you know. And what's interesting about this painting, when you compare it to other portraits, these are what the typical female portraits look like. And these two are half length. They're quarter turn. They're dressed in sumptuous fabrics. They're a little bit different than the male. There's a drape element. The women always hold objects in their hands, either a fan or a little watch or a flower. They're symbols of luxury, of femininity, beauty. They're bejeweled and fixed up. There's drape elements behind their head. But unlike the male portraits, usually you don't see a family crest, with some exceptions, or a cartouche. Okay? But this is typically what female portraits look like. And individuals who have written about Sor Juana kind of see some of that language in here, the way she's sitting, kind of daintily holding a rosary like it's a necklace. We see some of that kind of luxurious element integrated into this image of this nun. And another thing, this is really a groundbreaking portrait, because typically what we see are men in studies or at desks. Church founding fathers, evangelists. Okay, here Saint Jerome, Caravaggio, or Philippe de Champagne, Saint Augustine, being divinely inspired, writing. This is typically the subject. It's male. It's like a masculine pictorial framework, these studies. One of the few exceptions, of course, is Saint Teresa of Avila. We see any women writing, it's like Saint Teresa. You know, women were getting mixed messages in the convents, you know, because, and you see it in the writing of women. Nuns wrote autobiographies called vidas, and in the autobiographies, they start off by saying, I shouldn't be prideful, but I can't control myself, and then they write. You know, so it's like they're not supposed to be intellectuals and write, but they are intellectuals and they write. So there's like this kind of identity crisis, and you see it come out where they feel bad about being prideful, but they're compelled. You know, so this the vidas, the autobiographies, are really interesting. One of my colleagues at UNM writes about these autobiographies, Catherine McKnight. So in any case, so you have this tradition of scholars that's really attached to men in studies, one of the few exceptions. In New Spain, a genre of painting that's unique, also like casts or castas, are nun portraits. Nun portraits seem to really develop in the 18th century, and it's very particular to New Spain. We don't see this anywhere else. And I'm showing you 3 types of nun portraits. The one on the left is a portrait of a young woman about to enter the convent. Okay, she's a novitiate. She's a bride of Christ. She's dressed like a bride of Christ. She's dressed in the outfit of her convent. This is a painting that would have been commissioned by her family. Because typically when a daughter entered a convent, the family wouldn't see her very often or intermittently, or in some cases ever again, for a very long time. So they would commission. She would go to the convent, start her training, and then before taking her final vows, there would be a big party. And people would be invited to celebrate their daughter entering, because it was a big deal to those families. And this portrait would be commissioned, where it would be installed in the home to have some kind of remembrance of their daughter, and then she would enter the convent. So that's the first kind of portrait painting, which is the really well-known one. There have been books and articles. James Cordova just published a book a few years ago on this first category of nun portraits. It's an excellent book if you're interested in learning more about this. The second type of portrait is a small engraving that is part of those autobiographies nuns write. So very small, very few people would see them. They're in the Vidas. You open it and it's a portrait of the woman who's written this book. And it typically represents her sort of in the bloom of life. She's a community leader. She's a pious Catholic. So it's an idealized representation. And in this case, that's where you see women as scholars or, or as pious Christians. For example, in the one that I'm showing you here, she's standing in front of a desk surrounded by books. She's holding a document. She's some kind of leader. She's a community leader. Okay, and these are small engravings in the books. Okay, keep that in mind. The third class are death portraits. It's a very common tradition. We see this in Europe. It's definitely in Mexico. Later, when photography comes in, there are photographs of dead children and dead family members. This is before photography. We see this in painting. When a member of the convent passes away, her sisters would commission the production of a death portrait to keep in the convent after their sister is buried. So these are the main portrait types. So when you think about these being the main types of portraits of nuns, and you think about Miguel Cabrera, he's doing something different. These are just two examples of the Brides of Christ, just to kind of, since this is the most studied type of portrait. José de Alcibar's one of the superstars of the late 18th century. That's the one I showed you a little while ago. The one on the right, also by him, he painted both of these. Sor Maria Manuela. Very different convent cultures. One seems more austere, and humble. The other one's more luxurious. This kind of exemplifies the different cultures of convents, but the kinds of portraits that would have been commissioned by family members to keep in the home once their daughters or sisters entered the convent. When you look at Miguel Cabrera's, it's most similar to the second type of portrait, which ordinarily would be a print in a book. Here, what he's done is he's monumentalized the figure in a large-scale painting. He's really doing something new. He's really doing something different.
Are those engravings on wood, or are they etched?
They're engraved. Yeah, they're engraved on wood. And they're really small images. Yeah. It's just straight up like engraving, intaglio, printmaking. Yeah. And an interesting detail that kind of reinforces sort of his glorification of this Creole intellectual right at this moment in time is what's called the escudo. Escudo means shield. It's that medallion that we see in some of the nun portraits. The escudo de monja. Escudo de monja, which is something, they didn't wear this every day. It's like a ritual kind of element, or they're usually worn, like we see them in the portraits. And they're devotional images associated with that convent. And this one depicts the Annunciation. This is where Mary, following a Northern European model, is usually depicted reading a prayer book, and the angel appears and disturbs her. Okay, that's what we see. Here's a close-up of that detail. And here she is next to a painting by one of her contemporaries, Cristóbal de Villalpando, from the late 17th century. So it's like a colonial version of the Annunciation, painted by someone she knew. And then I want us to kind of think of her. And I'm writing an article on this, and I'm suggesting that what Cabrera is very clever. What he's doing is he is recreating the Annunciation and implicates us in the reading, where we're like the angel, where she's been reading, and we walk in and disturb her. And by doing so, we're kind of reinforcing sort of the significance of this historical figure. It's like she's recreating the Annunciation. It's like an echo. It's like something that I'm arguing in this article, which I probably shouldn't have said. Later, because someone's going to quote me, but it hasn't come out yet. No, it's okay. No, but do you see what I'm saying? It's like a quote. Yeah, it's like we're walking in because there's text. You know, she's always described as unique, as special, you know, and it's almost comparable to the way people talk about the Virgin as chosen among men. You know, so her unique status is something that's always brought forth. So it makes sense to me that what he's doing is he's kind of recreating the same kind of interaction that we see in the Annunciation, where we're like where we walk up, and by us engaging the painting, we're reenacting that and thus reinforcing.
And that's
Yeah.
making her
Yeah.
able to.
Yeah, yeah. And she's looking right at you.
I understand that this is the escudo.
Mhm.
Is the size larger than what would have been real in order for us to see the painting?
No, this is how big they were. They're huge. Mhm.
Or something that large?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of them have torted. They're really exquisite objects. Some of them are embroidered. Some of them are actual paintings. Some of the big painters, like Juan Correa, painted escudos. Yeah, yeah. And typically it's like a ritual kind of element, or you see it in the portraits. It's not something they wore daily.
That she would have chosen this escudo?
Yeah, each convent has a devotional image. It's like a devotional image associated with the convent or the nun.
Would have had the same one?
Yeah.